I think we can start. My name is Shmuel Shepkaru. Alan is away, so it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker and neighbor today. Dr. Lindsay Kozier is an assistant professor of English at Langston University, where she teaches British and world literature. Her research centers on issues of race, religion, and gender in 19th century Britain in general, and in particular, she focuses on Victorian Judaism. Her recent publications have appeared in Jewish Studies Quarterly, 19th Century Prose, and several edited collections published by Routledge. Dr. Katzir lives in Oklahoma City, with her husband, Dr. Brendan Katzir, and sons, Avigdor and Yonatan. Her topic of her talk today is Ghost of Dickens' Past, the Death of Judaism in Oliver Twist, and Our Mutual Friend. And after her talk, we will open the floor for questions. Dr. Katzir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, we have a little feedback here because my husband's in the room and he had his computer on as well. Hi, everyone. I want to thank OU for hosting me today. So this piece, The Ghosts of Dickens' Past, The Death of Judaism in Oliver Twist and Our Mutual Friend, really got its start back in 2014, the first time that I attended the Dickens Universe, which is basically a summer camp for academics and Dickens fans. And every year, Dickens Universe focuses on one novel. And that year, it happened to be Our Mutual Friend, which I had never read before that year. So I was recently asked by a friend of mine to contribute a piece to an anthology called The Theological Dickens, which will be out with Routledge at the end of the year. And she asked me to come up with something to say about Dickens and Jews that hadn't already been said before. So this is my attempt to say something new. I'm going to assume that most of you are already familiar with Oliver Twist, but I'm going to guess that less people have read Our Mutual Friend. Is there anyone in the audience who has read Our Mutual Friend? Probably not. Okay, so I'm not going to give you a summary because if you know Dickens, you know it's virtually impossible to summarize him quickly. So I will try to give you guys plot points as we go along. Charles Dickens is perhaps best known for his humanitarianism. The most mistreated members of society inhabit his fiction, and he spent his life critiquing the institutions that victimized them. His sympathy in famous novels such as Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, and Bleak House is unmistakable. But he is also known for the anti-Semitism that resounds through his writing, a contradiction especially embodied by Oliver Twist's Fagin. A masterful personification of Victorian London's underworld, Fagin is also an enduring anti-Semitic stereotype. Avaricious, mendacious, and treacherous, he has haunted the world's imagination since his inception back in 1837. Because readers have long loved Dickens, there has been an equally long-standing attempt to excuse his anti-Semitism. Thus, it has been argued that Dickens redeemed himself by creating Raya, the virtuous Jew of Our Mutual Friend, which was published in 1858. Having observed that Fagin and Raya are not so different, though, I offer a new view of Dickens and Jews by comparing these two characters. And that will be the substance of this talk. Dickens's conception of Judaism was clearly shaped by Christian history. He shared the tendency to see the Jew, the figure of the Jew, as incapable of achieving spiritual or moral transcendence while retaining his Jewishness. Because Dickens considered Christ to be the foundation of spiritual life, he consigned the Jews to spiritual death. Dickens portrays the death of Judaism through both Fagin's and Raya's estrangement from Jewish community and thus from Jewish continuity. So I'm going to give just a little bit of background on this scholarly conversation regarding Dickens's treatment of Jews in his novels. Most scholars believe that Dickens harbored at least some animus toward Jews until he sold his London residence, Tavistock House, to a couple named James and Eliza Davis in August 1860. And the Davises were Jewish. He complained to his friend Thomas Mitten that the purchaser of Tavistock House will be a Jew moneylender, but he afterward complimented the Davises as satisfactory, considerate, and trusting throughout the proceedings. So scholars usually take these comments to mean that Davis and her husband must have made a good impression on a prejudiced man, and that the incident brought home to Dickens the irrationality of some of his feelings about Jews. But Eliza Davis herself, the woman who really originated this scholarly argument about Dickens's perspective on Jews, she herself seemed doubtful of his conversion. So in June 1863, she wrote to him and pointed out, "It has been said that Charles Dickens has encouraged a vile prejudice against the despised Hebrew." Dickens replied by enclosing a charitable donation to the Lady Montefiore Memorial Fund, which was meant to show that he had no feeling towards the Jewish people, but a friendly one. So, some scholars have observed that from this letter, it seems like Dickens did not want to be seen as anti-Semitic. But as I have observed, his writings are replete with anti-Semitic imagery. According to these scholars, Davis inspired Dickens to reevaluate his own anti-Semitism. But once I got to thinking about this novel, Our Mutual Friend, I really rethought that perspective. So Dickens is said to have written Our Mutual Friend, that features this Jewish character, Raya, in part as an atonement for the anti-Semitism of Oliver Twist. In her letters, Davis laments that Fagin admits only of one interpretation. And for those of us who have read Oliver Twist or you've seen a film version, you know what that interpretation is, right? Fagin's a pretty vicious caricature. So Davis implored Dickens to atone for this great wrong. She later praised the introduction of the Jew Raya in the 7th number of Our Mutual Friend, keeping in mind that in the Victorian period, literature was usually serialized before it was published as a novel. So she sees him in this 7th edition. She ascribes his appearance to her intervention. So it's these letters where the so-called atonement narrative gets its start. This atonement narrative contends that Dickens meant for Raya to counteract Fagin. I'm not going to cite all of the scholars. I'd be happy to cite somebody in the Q&A if you like, but this is really gospel in Dickens' scholarship, this viewpoint. Some scholars also point to Dickens's later revision of Oliver Twist as evidence of his rehabilitation. In 1867, Chapman and Hall decided to publish a special edition of Dickens's collected works, which offered him the opportunity to revise his earlier writings. You may recall from reading Oliver Twist that Fagin is called the Jew throughout the original text, rarely ever by his name. And most modern editions of Oliver Twist actually do use that original 1838 text. So Fagin is called the Jew. But in this revision, Dickens excised almost all instances of this epithet, replacing it with his name Fagin. So for most scholars, this revision also answers Davis's complaint of anti-Semitism. Most scholars continue to uphold this atonement narrative. I heard a lecture about this in 2014 when I attended Dickens Universe. It's only been challenged by a couple of people, myself included. I question the atonement narrative in part because it just seems too simple and even too convenient. Maybe there's an element of wish fulfillment there. For one thing, the Jewish Chronicle, which is the Anglo-Jewish newspaper of record, it accused Dickens of anti-Semitism long before Davis. In fact, the publication regularly reproached famous figures like Thackeray, the author of Vanity Fair, and Dickens for fueling anti-Semitism. The editors were particularly offended by a couple of Dickens's shorter-lived periodicals, Bentley's Miscellany and Household Words, that published a lot of stories that utilized pretty standard anti-Semitic stereotypes. In 1854, the Jewish Chronicle declared, "Jews alone are excluded from the sympathizing heart of this great author and powerful friend of the oppressed." But Dickens himself refused to countenance such accusations. He responded to the Chronicle, "I know of no reason the Jews can have for regarding me as inimical to them." He later claimed the same to Davis, basically ignoring the fact that people had been criticizing Oliver Twist since it came out. These accusations appear to have evoked neither remorse nor reform in Dickens. His response to Davis is polite but insulting. He writes to her, "If the Jews felt he had done them such a great wrong, then they are far less sensible, far less just, and a far less good-tempered people than I have supposed them to be." He assured Davis that, "I always speak well of Jews, whether in public or private, and I bear my testimony to their perfect good faith in such transactions as I have ever had with them." It seems as though he forgot that a mere 2 years earlier, he wrote to his friend that he was suspicious of the Jew moneylender in the purchase of his home. "I shall never believe him until he has paid the money," Dickens says. James Davis was a solicitor, not a banker, but Dickens easily associated him with the stereotypes he replicated in his writings, which in 1864 still contained traces of anti-Semitism. In general, Dickens did not defend the Jews as he did others. Shalom Aleichem, who admired Dickens greatly, wrote to a Russian newspaper decrying how, when Charles Dickens needed to describe a thief who founds a school for thieves, he could find no other candidate in all of England but a Jew. This is sort of Fagin's main role in Oliver Twist. For those who aren't readily familiar with it, Fagin is the leader of a criminal gang of children. Davis believed that Dickens, the large-hearted, whose works plead so eloquently and so nobly for the oppressed of his country, stoked anti-Semitism with his writings. Indeed, Dickens never really apologized for Fagin, a figure who was born again and again in characters like Ebenezer Scrooge, Uriah Heep, one of the villains of David Copperfield, and Riah himself. Ultimately, scholars have overstated the creation of this character, Riah. Dickens himself gives us no evidence in Our Mutual Friend or anywhere else that he intended Riah to serve as an atonement for Fagin. Rather, it's Miss Davis who understood Riah to be a correction of Fagin. So in 1867, she sent Dickens a Hebrew Bible that was inscribed, "To Charles Dickens, in grateful and admiring recognition of his having exercised the noblest quality man can possess, that of atoning for an injury as soon as conscious of having inflicted it." In fact, the atonement narrative that I've described here obscures the significant similarities between Oliver Twist and Our Mutual Friend. So that's what I'm about to get into, these similarities. So as part of the neat narrative of Dickens's contrition, scholars see Fagin and Riah as representing two contrasting myths of the Jew that were circulating in the 19th century. So this idea of the Jew as a villain, as a degraded inferior, and the idea of the Jew as being naturally good and spiritual. One scholar claims, as one scholar claims, Fagin is villainous while Riah is virtuous, then from her perspective, an examination of Fagin and Riah as the embodiments of opposing Jewish stereotypes may possibly reveal something of Dickens's shifting attitudes towards Jews. However, I don't totally buy this argument, so I compare Fagin and Riah as examples of equivalent anti-Semitic stereotypes, revealing Dickens's largely unchanged attitude towards Jews and Judaism from Oliver Twist to Our Mutual Friend. First, both resemble the stage Jew of medieval and Elizabethan drama. This is a stock character that appeared throughout plays in the medieval and Elizabethan period. This character was a rapacious moneylender, a thieving peddler, or old clothes dealer. He shuffled about the stage in his black gabardine and his broad-brimmed hat. He typically had red hair, a red beard, and a hooked nose, this stock character. So like this stock character, Fagin's face is described as villainous looking and repulsive, and it's veiled by a quantity of matted red hair. He has a hooked nose and a shuffling gait. Raya's face is obscured by long hair and a beard. He walks with his head bowed and his eyes cast down, wearing a shovel hat and gabardine. This is Dickens's description. As is typical of anti-Semitic stereotypes throughout British literature, both old men dress shabbily and they speak cringingly. Fagin is grotesque, Raya is grotesquely virtuous. So scholars do see these traits in Fagin, but only one that I have found observes that Raya functions in Dickens's novel as a stage Jew. But this person sees Raya as a reversal of the stereotype, not as a simple reoccurrence of it like I do. Second, both characters are associated with the buying and selling of old clothes, which was a common vocation among Victorian Jews. In 1837, most Victorian Jews were impoverished, unskilled, and uneducated, undertaking various street trades to survive. By 1864, when Our Mutual Friend was first issued, their situation had improved, but many continued to hawk clothing, rags, and rubbish in the streets. So Fagin is ostensibly an old clothes dealer. He's well known at Rag Fair, which is a market in the East End where Jews purchase secondhand clothing to sell. That's what an old clothes man would do. He would buy secondhand clothing and then resell it for a profit. Mr. Brownlow, character from Oliver Twist, the character who ends up adopting Oliver, spurns Fagin for his disreputable associates, including the old clothes dealer who helps Fagin to abduct Oliver by revealing Oliver's whereabouts. Fagin himself becomes a dangling heap of clothes upon his death. He's hanged at the end, and this is his image of himself once he dies. When meeting Raya, Eugene Rayburn, who I want to point out is one of the main protagonists of Our Mutual Friend, he's sort of an upper class anti-Semite, he dismisses Raya as an old clothes man and endeavors to separate him from his friend Lizzie Hexam, whom Eugene is obsessed with. Raya spends most of the novel trying to protect Lizzie from Eugene's advances. Both characters are ostracized as a result of the old clothes association. Third, both are portrayed as criminals, which coincides with an increase in the incidence of Jewish criminal activity in London. Defending himself against Davis, Dickens insists it unfortunately was true of the time to which Oliver Twist refers, that class of criminal almost invariably was a Jew. This criminal class largely comprised Jewish peddlers dealing in stolen property. So old clothes sellers acquired their poor reputation from those who, like Fagin, worked as professional thieves with connections to criminal organizations and outlets. Most scholars denounce Fagin for his villainy while celebrating Raya for his integrity, right? Raya, this good and honest character who protects the friendless. But Raya willingly misrepresents himself as the corrupt moneylender behind a firm belonging to his boss. That's sort of Raya's role in the novel, is that he's hired by a man called Fascination Fledgeby to act as the front, the sort of like cruel, ruthless front to his money lending business. According to Fledgeby, the fact that Raya is Jewish is what makes it believable. And Raya goes along with this. He's not the criminal that Fagin is, but he's characterized as one. So both resemble Shylock, the miserly Jew of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, perhaps the most famous Jew of British literature. Fagin jealously guards his stolen treasures and purposefully withholds money from his associates, and he excuses himself as only a miser rather than a criminal and a murderer. Raya is not miserly, but because of his professional arrangement, he must act so towards the victims of Fledgeby's firm. So, for most scholars, Raya represents a profound reversal of the Shylock stereotype. But in the case of our mutual friend, that subversion seems immaterial. Characters readily identify Raya with Shylock because of his stereotypical appearance, which for Fledgeby makes him such a good one for the part. Mortimer Lightwood, a friend of Eugene Rayburn's, tells Eugene that he had an interview with a Jew, Raya, who seems determined to press them hard regarding their money troubles. Mortimer describes him as quite a Shylock. Dickens merely projects the Shylock stereotype onto Fledgeby rather than dismantling it through Raya. Most scholars agree that Fledgeby, the evil Christian, is really the Shylock here. But Raya leaves Fledgeby's firm repentant, but he later reprises his role as Shylock when lending money for a third party. Next, both cultivate inappropriate relationships with children. For one, their relationships recall the medieval blood libel, a legend in which Jews kidnapped Christian children for use in unholy rites, draining their blood to make matzah for Passover. So if you've never heard of the blood libel, this is the blood libel legend. So in Dickens's modernized version of the blood libel, Fagin abducts and corrupts orphans, sending them to the gallows in his stead, right? So he has these children go out stealing things that he later sells to make money, and rather than ever letting himself get caught, he lets the children get caught in, and many of them are hanged. By amusing and nurturing Oliver, the wily old Jew prepared his mind, slowly instilling into his soul the poison which he hoped would blacken it and change its hue forever. And Raya essentially abducts Lizzie when he finds her on the streets and takes her to a hideout. He takes her to a family of Jews living in the country. But this causes the other characters in the novel to fear she has been corrupted or converted by the Jews. They also function as perverse schoolmasters. Fagin houses and educates his orphan children, teaching them to pickpocket. Raya also houses and educates the orphan children, Lizzie and Jenny, teaching them how to read and write. So scholars typically contrast them as educators, noting that Fagin abuses Oliver and prostitutes Nancy, if you'll remember Nancy from Oliver Twist, one of the gang, whereas Raya nurtures Jenny, an orphaned girl, and protects Lizzie, another orphaned girl. But as with the other stereotypes, Raya is still perceived as perverse. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, that even though Raya is a good character, he is perceived by other characters in the novel the same way that Fagin is, and this perception is never fully rectified. Fledgeby accuses Raya of desiring Lizzie, whom he's supposed to be protecting, pressing him to out with his reason for having his spoon in the soup, or for guarding her against Eugene's attentions. Raya rebuffs this implication, but Eugene realizes that Raya stands steadfastly between him and Lizzie, as though Raya were responsible for her sexuality, like a pimp. During this period, Jews were found to be keeping brothels and working as prostitutes, so the association is not far-fetched. So of these stereotypes, the last one that I think is the most concerning is that both are depicted as religious caricatures. Dickens describes Raya as professing the Jewish faith, and he points out to Eliza Davis that Fagin is called the Jew, not because of his religion, but because of his race. This is a very famous line from these letters between himself and Eliza Davis. And this line has caused most scholars to assume that Fagin is not religious. But Dickens never claims that Fagin is not religious. He just claims that Judaism is not the source of his personal animus towards Jews. It's important to note that Victorian Jews did not think of religion and race as distinct categories. Some were merely more remiss in their religious observance than others. During the 18th and 19th centuries, most were not Orthodox in the modern sense of the term, despite belonging to congregations whose ritual and religious leadership were Orthodox. Only some practiced Judaism faithfully by observing kashrut, attending synagogue, studying Torah, celebrating Shabbat. The rich often rejected the regimented and segregated nature of traditional life, and the poor became more casual in their observance of rituals and customs, with some ceasing to practice entirely. Even those who regularly attended Shabbat services would later that day be found at theaters, concerts, exhibitions, races, restaurants, all in violation of Sabbath laws. So, when discussing Judaism and Dickens, most scholars equate the term religious with pious, overlooking the historical fact that some were either bad people or bad Jews, those who considered themselves Orthodox but were not meticulously observant. And it's this stereotype in particular that dominates Dickens's depiction of Jews. So when assessing Fagin's religiosity, scholars generally first examine his diet. It's important to understand that most Victorian Jews did not follow Judaism's dietary laws precisely. Many of them ate unkosher foods in public. Even figures like Sir Moses and Judith Montefiore ate unkosher meat when traveling earlier in their lives, even though they were observant. Scholars tend to hold Fagin to more stringent standards, arguing that when we first see him, he's cooking sausages, which is true, meaning it's clear that the dietary laws and the customs of the community mean nothing to him. It is true, Fagin cooks sausages, but he also boils coffee and toasts bread. He does all of this for his gang. He sits down with them to breakfast on coffee and hot rolls and ham, and later holds a small sausage and a small loaf of bread in his hand. But Fagin himself never actually is pictured eating anything, whereas Oliver ate his share of sausages. All the characters are drinking coffee and taking bites of bread. So Fagin is not kosher, strictly speaking, but neither were most of his historical co-religionists. Scholars also scrutinize Fagin's dress. Medieval and Renaissance Jews were known for wearing gabardines, which would be like the black jacket and robes. In the 18th century, Polish Jews also began wearing caftans. By the mid-19th century, Orthodox immigration to Britain had increased, making religious men more visible, a contrast to the unobservant who had already assimilated sartorially. Raya wears a large-brimmed, low-crowned hat and a long-skirted coat, which Dickens and his characters identify as a hat and gabardine, the traditional ensemble of the Polish Orthodox. Scholars typically point out that Fagin and Raya, or they claim that Fagin and Raya don't dress the same, but have some images I can show if anyone's so inclined. I can show them during the Q&A. Images from Dickens's novels, which are always illustrated, that do show them wearing the same outfits. Fagin is introduced wearing a greasy flannel gown, a sort of debased caftan. He wears an old greatcoat, and the illustrations show him wearing the gabardine. Eliza Davis told Dickens that people like Raya usually dress as their neighbors do, and before the present fashion of beards prevailed, they did not wear them unless indeed they are Polish Orthodox. So dressing and looking like Raya indicates that Fagin has at least a nominal relationship to traditional religiosity. And I go into detail about that because the scholarly perception is just that Fagin has no connection to the religious community. Finally, scholars point out that the condemned Fagin rejects religious intercession. So at the end of the novel, Fagin is finally caught and hanged for his crimes. Before he is hanged, venerable men of his own persuasion had come to pray beside him, but he had driven them away with curses. They renewed their charitable efforts and he beat them off. Most see this passage as significant evidence of Fagin's irreligiosity. Indeed, at one time he raved and blasphemed, but at another he howled and tore his hair. In the Tanakh, the tearing of hair is often symbolic of repentance. For example, when Ezra contemplates the great sins of the Israelites, he is recorded as having rent his garment and his mantle and plucked off the hair of his head and of his beard and sat down appalled. Notably, Fagin's erratic and blasphemous prayer service occurs on Shabbat. It's pointed out that this occurs all on a Saturday. As Davis observes, Raya also utters blasphemies, being made to say, "They curse me in the divine name." He uses the name. And she points out, no Jew ever utters the appellation of the Creator, even in his prayers, making a hypocrite of Raya as well. So with this overview of the similar stereotypes, I'm not suggesting that Fagin is a pious person or that Raya is an evil person, but rather that Dickens relied on all the same stereotypes in his creation of these characters, which really brings into question that atonement narrative that I spoke about earlier. I'm going to check my time. All right. So I have one last point that I want to make about the death of Judaism. So by portraying Fagin and Raya as hypocrites and legalists, Dickens marshals stereotypes from Christian theology. So the stage Jew, the old clothes man, moneylender, the blood libel stereotypes, these all originated with medieval Christianity. The tropes of falseness, avariciousness, abusiveness all come directly from the New Testament. And Christianity has long equated Judaism with death. The New Testament vividly elaborates this metaphor. Calling Jews hypocrites, Jesus likens them to whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth. They are also described as unmarked graves, and people walk over them without realizing it. These passages represent Jews as outwardly pure, but spiritually dead by comparing them to graves. Jesus also dubs them the children of Satan, being synonymous with death. Because the New Testament is supposed to have superseded the Hebrew Bible, the birth of Christianity has been seen as the end of Judaism. Dickens famously scorned the Hebrew Bible, deriving his religious views exclusively from the New Testament. And like the New Testament, he proclaims the death of Judaism in several ways. To start, Fagin and Raya are perceived as ghosts, vampires, and devils, all avatars of death. Scholars have regularly noted that Jenny, one of the little girls that Raya is friends with, she refers to Raya as her fairy godmother, but Raya is more specter than sprite. He is described as ascending to a prophet's tomb, haunting a churchyard in his long-skirted coat, and stealing through the streets in his ancient dress like the ghost of a departed time. Similarly, Fagin is envisioned as an ugly ghost just rose from the grave, a hideous phantom moist from the grave, and an old carcass that belongs in a grave. Raya comes out of his grave like a vampire, and Fagin's home, which resembles a coffin, is as dark as the grave. Like vampires, Raya is supposed to be a bloodsucker, and Fagin is nocturnal, roaming only at night. Scholars know Fagin as the merry old gentleman. This is something that the narrator of Oliver Twist calls Fagin pretty frequently. It's a well-known euphemism for Satan. But few know that Raya is also described as devilish. Bill Sykes, one of the main characters of Oliver Twist, he's known as the Housebreaker, one of Fagin's gang, he assumes that Fagin's father is singeing his grizzled red beard by this time, unless Fagin came straight from the old one without any father at all betwixt them. So according to Sykes, Fagin is the son of the old one, or the devil, and according to Fledgeby, Raya is the old one himself. Raya disappears into the fog and was lost to onlookers, just as Fagin disappears from Oliver's window, leaving not even the traces of recent footsteps. This scene is regularly seen as evidence of Fagin's demonic powers, that he's a shapeshifter. Likewise, Jenny imagines Raya to be a shapeshifter. She describes him as looking so unlike the rest of people, and so much as if he had changed himself into that shape. So in both novels, Dickens underscores the gospel's perspective on Judaism by depicting Jews as unredeemed fiends that haunt the faithful. But Dickens goes further than this. He characterizes Jewish texts as spiritually dead by endowing his Jewish characters with these so-called Old Testament traits. So the phrase the God of the Old Testament is a common signifier among those who repudiate the themes of the Hebrew Bible. This dichotomy was fairly well traversed in the 19th century, this dichotomy between the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament. He has been pronounced as harsh and unforgiving. Accordingly, Fagin punishes Nancy for a single infraction, encouraging Sykes to kill her for betraying the gang. And Raya calls Lizzie's brother, whom she's had an argument with, a thankless dog and exhorts her to let him go, to cut him out of her life. The Talmud has also been described as harsh and unforgiving, and so Talmudists are seen as elevating the letter of the law over the spirit of the law. So Raya is called a methodical, scribe-like figure, which is suggestive of Jesus's admonishment of the scribes and Pharisees who resemble graves, and Fagin is fittingly destroyed by a legal system that shows him no mercy. In fact, Dickens critiques Jewish thought as legalistic by comparing Judaism to materialism. Specifically, Fagin and Raya approach work as Orthodox Jews would approach ritual, with strict meticulousness. Oliver trains with the artful Dodger, who's the child leader of the gang, who understands the catechism of his trade, having been taught by Fagin himself. Dodger and Charlie Bates, Fagin's standout pupils, practice thievery according to the gang's little code of laws, and so they abandon Oliver to the authorities to protect themselves at an early scene in the novel when the boys are caught pickpocketing. These two renowned and learned sages, as Dickens described them, evince great wisdom and foresight in providing against every possible contingency which can be supposed at all likely to affect themselves. And they have a particular way of rationalizing abandoning Oliver. Unlike the stereotype of the Talmudist, Fagin and his gang interpret laws to suit their whims, a practice that has disastrous consequences for Oliver when he's hauled off to jail. Likewise, understanding his trade, Raya recalls a loan from a minor character in the novel, reminding this character he's invested with no authority to show mercy. Raya meticulously observes all the laws of Pubsey & Co., which is the firm he represents, and this discovery causes little Jenny to claim, "You're not the godmother at all, but the wicked wolf," just as Paul likens the Jews' obsession with ritual to the behavior of Canaanites. So in both examples, Jews are believed to value wealth over truth, much like Judas, the ancient foe of the Christian Redeemer from the Gospels. For Victorian Christians, Jews bore the guilt of Judas's betrayal and the collective guilt attributed to the Jews in the Christian scriptures, especially in relation to Judas's betrayal of Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Indeed, Fagin and Raya both trade in money, but they resemble Judas in other ways too. Fagin's red hair corresponds to diabolical images of Judas, and Raya is repeatedly called Judah, the Hebrew name of Judas, a generic insult made more significant by Jenny's accusation that if ever her dear Lizzie is sold and betrayed, she shall know Raya sold and betrayed her. Dickens rejected the supposed religious cruelty of the Old Testament, instead trusting that the God of the New Testament is the God who forgives. Dickens believed that the New Testament promised life, while the Hebrew Bible ensured death, a conviction revealed through Fagin, who worries he will shake and tremble, a reference to Psalm 77, when he approaches the gallows. Finally, Dickens declares the death of the Jewish faith, the real ghost of a departed time. For him, Judaism has no place in modernity, and he illustrates this idea in three major ways. First, ritualism is represented as morally dead. Fagin explicitly worships wealth, and at one scene early on, he holds a short ceremony that almost resembles a Torah service, where he approaches an ark, removes a box that he places on a table as though he means to read it. The box is full of jewels. And he reveres each item, uttering prayers for the dead, the children who obtained the items at the expense of their lives. He also gives a mini sermon on the merits of capital punishment, right? The children are all dead and can't rat him out. Later, after Oliver escapes from Fagin, Fagin plans to shut up his shop. Since Oliver carries a potential payout for Fagin, Fagin has, he's in league with a character named Monks, and the two plan to get rid of Oliver because Oliver stands to inherit a great fortune. So Fagin plans to close his business to find Oliver, as though he were shutting up his shop for Shabbat. According to Jesus, man cannot serve both God and mammon. Fagin's devotion to wealth leads to his death. Raya holds a worship service that Jenny literally describes as being dead. So this is an interesting scene in Our Mutual Friend where Raya, Jenny, and Lizzie are all up on the rooftop of the firm that Raya works for. And they're having a peaceful, tranquil, restful time. They come here for rest. But the way Jenny describes it's very interesting. She describes them being on the rooftop as being dead. She reminds Fledgeby, who comes to see this spectacle, of his outsider status, that he is not dead and he should get down to life, meaning that he should leave. Like Jewish ceremonies, the rooftop service contains repetitious chanting, with Jenny repeating, "Come back and be dead, come back and be dead." Although the congregants feel strengthened by this service, the rooftop is only available to them because Raya sold his soul to Mammon, or in this case, Fledgeby. Neither Raya nor Fagin is seen observing Jewish rites, but they are shown worshiping death, a practice that is incompatible with Dickens's concept of morality. Second, Christianity is presented as the only path to life. At the close of Oliver Twist, Dickens contrasts Fagin's death with Oliver's rebirth in his new family. He has escaped Fagin's clutches and he is reborn out in the countryside. Fagin never held or defined any positive hopes of mercy, whereas Oliver shows gratitude to the being whose code is mercy. The inhabitants of this village retreat where Oliver goes at the end of the novel, all of the good characters, they practice a true Christianity characterized by mercy and benevolence, the antithesis of Dickens's harsh and unforgiving Judaism. Fagin's death indicates that Dickens saw Judaism as spiritually insufficient and less fulfilled by Christianity because Fagin suffers for refusing to develop. So Raya, the good Jew of the atonement narrative, is figuratively converted. Throughout Our Mutual Friend, Eugene calls him Aaron, knowing his name is Raya. One scholar argues that this is done just to be anti-Semitic. And yes, Eugene is anti-Semitic, but the name also serves a conversionary function. Eugene tells his friend Lightwood, "It comes into my mind that, no doubt, with an instinctive desire to receive him into the bosom of our church, I gave him the name of Aaron." Even though Aaron is the high priest of Judaism, Eugene means to baptize Raya by renaming him. Unlike Fagin, who speaks in Hebrew verse, Raya echoes the Gospels, telling Lizzie to shake the dust from her feet, an allusion to Matthew 10:14. By abandoning his vocation, Raya embraces the so-called greater covenant of Christianity. So Dickens atones for Fagin by making Raya a decent person, which for Dickens is synonymous with being a good Christian. Finally, and this is the last point that I'll make before the Q&A, neither one of these characters enlivens Judaism by joining Jewish communities or building Jewish families. Scholars tend to agree that both characters are outsiders to British society. And that is clear. But more glaringly, neither has meaningful relationships with the Jewish community. Some see Fagin as part of a peddling network of Jews because he knows a couple of Jews. Uh, Others see Raya as part of a networking Jewish community because he has a couple of nameless acquaintances that live on the outskirts of town. They both live in central Jewish districts of London, but both are outsiders to the Jewish community. Fagin realizes he will be the only mourner in his funeral train, and Raya does not turn to the Jewish community for help in his poverty. So both characters destroy traditions by neglecting them. Dickens also denies both characters the chance to participate in Jewish world building by having families. Scholars have argued that Fagin seems feminine because, as a surrogate mother, he cooks for and plays with orphans. He is described as effeminate, as wearing feminine clothes. Raya is described as a fairy godmother. His gabardine is described as feminine. So although they come across as mothers, they have no Jewish children, serving as surrogates to Christians instead. In fact, scholars describe them as unmanned, desexualized, and lacking sexual self-interest, placing them apart from other denizens of Dickens's novels who usually form traditional families. Fagin has no familial origins or context, treating his treasures as he would a favored child. And even worse, Raya tells Jenny, some beloved companionship fades out of most lives. That of a wife and a daughter and a son of promise has faded out of my own life. Raya lost his family and limps on toward his own death. Both characters represent the brokenness of Judaism, a religion Dickens believed to be anachronistic, comprised of a people he believed to be malevolent. Discounting the spiritual aims of Judaism, Dickens interprets Jews' adherence to ritualism as focused not on divine law, but instead on self-serving criminality. Ultimately, Fagin and Raya are rootless and childless. Unlike Abraham, they have no calling from God, no promise of generations of Jewish descendants, and no inheritance in this world or the world to come. For my concluding point, I want to point out that I am not suggesting that Dickens is anti-Semitic, but I'm arguing that his perspective on Judaism conformed to stereotypes that were created by Christianity and that persist to this day. These stereotypes have harmed real Jews throughout history. Because Dickens is greatly beloved by readers the world over, and because they would rather not think badly of him, they have decided he must have had some great change of heart. And this impulse is understandable. I myself love Dickens, and I credit him with my early interest in pursuing a career in the professoriate, which has allowed me to write about my true love, which is Judaism and Jewish literature. But we readers, students, and scholars of Dickens cannot know how he really felt or what he truly believed, so we must turn to his work for answers. His work indicates that, at the very least, he harbored some anti-Semitic prejudices. Dickens was haunted by the specter of Fagin throughout his career. We are still haunted by the ghosts of Auschwitz. So we must continue to confront anti-Semitism wherever we may find it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Katzir. That was wonderful. And we are ready for your questions. It's difficult for me to see all of you, so if you raise your hand and there is no reaction, please jump in.
Yeah, please.
Yes, please, Daniela.
Hi, Lindsay. Thank you for that. I think you're being generous when you say you're not sure whether he was anti-Semitic. I mean,
Well,
I'm surprised to know that the scholars seem a bit naive on this question. But one of the things I wonder about is thinking about these figures in terms of the larger novels and the other characters. they are not in some ways significantly different from the horrific characters that abound in Dickens' novels, who are greedy, who are sexually disturbing,
Mhm.
who take advantage of children. So I'm wondering what you make of the fact that characters who are also clearly Jewish, in fact, replicate the evils and the forms of cruelty that one sees associated with capitalism, imperialism, and other forms of power that Dickens is very explicitly critical of.
Mhm. Yeah, and there are a couple of really fascinating articles on that topic, on those topics. So I make of it that Dickens is replicating the same conversations and stereotypes that are going on in the 19th century, where Jews are associated with things like imperialism, with capitalism, especially. You know, it's Dracula is actually seen as a well-known critique of Jews' involvement in capitalism, even though Dracula himself is not Jewish. He's a vampire who, you know, sucks the blood from everyone, and it's commonly read as a capitalist, as a critique of capitalism. And yeah, I think that I absolutely think that Dickens is joining that conversation and really endorsing it, because as Eliza Davis and many of Dickens's contemporaries point out, Fagin and Raya are the only Jews. They are meant to stand in for the entire Jewish community, which is very different than Dickens's non-Jewish characters, right? Like, as you pointed out, Dickens has characters who are Christian nominally, who run the gamut of extremely evil and manipulative and extremely good, right? But you don't have that contrast with Jews. They are simply the only Jews. And so I think you can draw the conclusion that Dickens had those associations with Jews and all of those institutions that you mentioned, because they're the only characters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just think it's very interesting that these characters who, even though you're saying, you're pointing out these are the unique examples, they nonetheless in every way resemble the Christian characters. So I'm just interested in that, in the fact that there are not really specific differences here, but rather villains who are actually recall one another throughout his novels in
Yeah.
particular ways. So
And
it's kind of an interesting thing.
yeah, and the only thing I can say to that is just that there are, as several scholars and Dickens's own contemporaries pointed out, there are at least good Christian characters. There are bad ones, but there are good ones, and that's not true of the Jews. So yeah. Do we have any other questions? I would be happy to. While y'all are thinking about questions, let me show you a couple of pictures. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you a couple of those illustrations that I mentioned. So here is a picture of, you can see Fagin here in the background. He's got his hat, he's got his gabardine here, and I got a couple more. Let's see. I am not great at screen sharing. I apologize. I've taught on Zoom all year, and all right, those are my kids. Oh, here we go. So here's another one. You can see how he is dressed in Cruikshank's original illustrations. I've got a third one here to show you. Yep, here he is again in his hat, his beard. He's watching Oliver. And he looks similar to, this is Raya. I'm sorry, this is the best quality version of this photograph I can find, but you can see him also wearing his gabardine and the same style of hat that Fagin wears. And here he is again. So I think these are just important visual cues to keep in mind, because the readers would have seen these images and had the same associations. I think I see a hand up. Oh, okay. Carl?
Yeah, two somewhat linked questions and comment. One is, in what way is Dickens portrayed in the schools and in colleges today, taking into account all the things that you talked about? Is that addressed in any way? And if so, how? Because there certainly are parallels with the problems of racism. And as Ibram Kendi has said very succinctly, if you say you're not a racist, you probably are.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. That's a great point. So I can really only speak to the way I teach Dickens, which I have taught him copiously in my Victorian Lit seminar. So I love Dickens, like I said, and Dickens' anti-Semitism, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't stop me from liking him. I don't know. That's just a personal thing. But I do a whole unit where I talk about Jewish civil disabilities in this period, where Jews are, they don't have full extent of legal rights. And I describe the battle for civil rights, and I frame it with Jewish authors, such as people like Israel Zangwill, who wrote later in the century, but Grace Aguilar, who was a contemporary of Dickens and who she was a female Jewish religious theologian who wrote extensively about Jews' fight for legal rights. And so I don't shy away from the way that Fagin is portrayed, but I invite my students to have honest conversations about anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and racism as we see it in the Victorian period. So I teach it simultaneously with other movements for equality in the period. We just got done reading Mary Prince's autobiography on her life as a slave. So yeah.
Well, your approach may be very laudable.
Thank
you. To what degree are you in any way representative of the way Dickens is portrayed across the country? And part of my question is asking, to what degree does all of this get totally ignored in the teaching of Dickens in high schools and in colleges?
I mean, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say I believe that it is ignored, because I'm also a product of, I have 3 English degrees. I'm also a product of that kind of education. And I, as an undergrad, don't recall anyone ever saying the word Jew at all in any of my English literature classes. It was never brought up, for good or for ill. I do believe that it is ignored. And some of the teaching, this scholarly gospel about how, oh, Fagin is the bad Jew and Dickens atoned for him by creating Raya, I have seen that taught by professors, because it's just a very popular perspective. So I would say there's 2 approaches. It's either ignored, or this scholarly perspective is what is taught.
Lindsay.
Hey,
Hey.
this is one of my colleagues from Langston.
Thank you. That was a really interesting talk. And my question, and again, you might not be able to answer this, but is thinking about kind of building off from that idea of, universities, high schools, but even just like public perceptions of Dickens. I mean, when you think about Dickens, he's like a British lit big, right? Like Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Shakespeare, and in like British society, there's so much about these individuals that's represented in TV to movies to, everything. And so like, as you think about in today's day and age, as we're reconceptualizing these bigs, I guess you could say, or just literary heroes, in a day and age that like, Dr. Seuss went down a couple weeks ago or a couple months ago. And so I'm just curious about like, what's the public perception, or is, again, this is something just that typically gets ignored when you look at like anti-Semitism, broadly speaking?
So I will say that I can't remember if it's the Guardian or the Telegraph, some British newspaper, that they do like a Dickens book club, and they have readers, they nominate a book, and then they have readers write in about it as they're all reading it together. And their most recent pick was Our Mutual Friend. And I read through some of the reviews of Our Mutual Friend and some of the comments, and I don't recall seeing anybody mention the character Raya or Judaism or anti-Semitism at all. And I do believe that, I mean, especially in America, I do believe that anti-Semitism is looked over. I teach it in all of my classes, but I just don't think that problems of anti-Semitism are brought up unless the teacher or the professor in question has a personal stake in it. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So I think that Britain, I mean, I do think there's a problem, like a blind spot. I don't advocate the canceling of Dickens, but I just think it doesn't hurt to be critical of some of these big authors.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but thank you all for joining us, and let's thank Dr. Katzir together for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your attendance.